Hello, um, my name is Sol Soler, and I'm a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, and I've written the principles of the physics of consciousness. Okay, and this is the fifth part in a lecture series explaining the principles and justifying them, and this is actually a formal statement of the principles. So I'm going to state all of the principles, and I'm going to explain and justify them. So this is an essay I wrote that I published online because people were asking for a formal statement of the principles. And what I'm going to do is read through that essay, and at different points throughout the essay, I'm going to stop reading and explain what I've said, what I've written, to try and make things as clear as possible. And you should find this very interesting because these principles are actually the scientific solution of the long-standing mystery of consciousness known as the hard problem of consciousness. So this is the scientific solution, or these principles form the scientific solution of the hard problem of consciousness. This is the fifth in the series of lectures, so after you've listened to this, you might want to go back and check out the other 4 lectures that kind of explain how I derived these principles in more detail. So these are a statement of the principles. In the first 4 lectures, I explained how I came to write these principles and why they are the way they are. But you could definitely listen to this lecture first and then go back to those 4 lectures. I think this actually could be a good lecture to listen to first. So yeah, a formal statement of the principles of the physics of consciousness. And if you pay attention, and it's new physics, so it will take some study. It will depend how familiar you are with physics and with the study of consciousness. But a little bit of study, a little bit of reflection, and you will understand the scientific solution to the hard problem of consciousness, which is a very famous and old problem. Okay, so let's begin. A formal statement of the principles of the physics of consciousness. We begin with requirements of any scientific theory of consciousness. 1. It must be grounded in our empirical observations of physical reality. Our theory must only make reference to well-defined, empirically observable physical phenomena. This means no reference to any unobserved substances or extra dimensions too small to be physically detected, or infinities of extra universes, the existence of which can't possibly be verified. Okay, so we want to be strictly scientific. So no extra dimensions that have never been measured, that can't be measured because all our measuring apparatus only exists in a normal 3 space dimensions. No infinities of extra universes that we can't possibly verify, and no unobserved substances. So we can't say, for example, consciousness is some yet to be observed substance from another dimension or from a different universe or anything like that. We want to stick with only what, according to science, has physical reality in our universe. Okay, number 2, must logically solve the hard problem of consciousness. And just to say, we know what has physical reality, or according to science, we know what has physical reality in our universe, and that is energy, and things formed out of everything is formed out of energy that has physical reality in our universe, and exists within space-time, and space-time is technically defined by Albert Einstein in general relativity. That's our best description of space-time so far. Okay, 2, it must logically solve the hard problem of consciousness. Of course, if your theory doesn't solve the hard problem, then, it's not a good theory of consciousness. 3, third requirement, must include a valid scientific definition of consciousness grounded in both well-defined, empirically observable physical realities, such as physical energy and matter and space-time, as well as our own personal subjective experience of consciousness. 4, must include a set of simple, comprehensible, and teachable scientific principles that anyone can understand and that can be used to construct models of conscious systems such as human conscious physiology. Okay, so your theory has to be intelligible to normal people. People have to be able to understand it, obviously. And number 5, align with and make sense of our conscious experience as physico-conscious entities. So, our only experience of subjective consciousness is our own. That's our evidence for consciousness. The only reason you know consciousness exists is because you're conscious and because you've experienced your own consciousness. You've never experienced anyone else's consciousness apart from your own. So our theory needs to align, our theory of consciousness needs to align with our evidence of consciousness. And the only evidence we have of consciousness is our own. Okay, so those are 5 requirements for any good scientific theory of consciousness. And you can use those requirements to test whether a theory is a good theory of consciousness. If it doesn't satisfy all those requirements, you know you don't have a good theory, a scientific theory of consciousness. Okay. So we move on. The theory defined by the following principles, in conjunction with the scientific definition of consciousness linked below, satisfies all of the above requirements. We work by way of analogy with Newtonian mechanics. Newton stated a small number of empirically justified laws and principles. Over the course of 3 centuries, these principles were used to construct an approximate mathematical map of the objectively observed dynamics of macroscopic physical objects and systems within our universe. Similarly, the following simple laws and principles can be used to construct mathematical maps of both the microscopic and macroscopic physico-conscious dynamics of our universe. The fact that my theory works in such close analogy with Newtonian mechanics is further evidence of its validity. Okay, so that's the great thing about my theory, is it works in exactly the same way that Newton's theory works, or Newtonian mechanics works. He gave his 3 laws of motion and his law of gravity, and he used those things to derive other principles, such as the conservation of momentum, and he used them to construct theoretical models of mechanical systems. So my theory works in the same way, with simple, well-defined principles and laws that we can use to make models. Okay, so now we begin with the first principle. And the first principle is actually a law of our universe. And I should say that the credit for this law actually goes to Immanuel Kant, famous German philosopher working in the 1800s. And he didn't state it explicitly, but it's implicit in his work on what he called the thing in itself. Okay, so that's just credit where credit is due, Immanuel Kant. So this is the number 1, the law of privacy. Statement: the only way to directly observe any conscious experience is to be the physical formation of energy and particles experiencing the experience within itself. Or equivalently, consciousness is not a purely objective phenomenon, and the subjective aspects of consciousness are purely subjective and cannot be objectively observed or defined. Okay. For example, the only subjective conscious experience you have ever directly observed is the conscious experience you experience within your own physical form. You have never directly observed any conscious experience apart from your own. You can check that for yourself. Have you ever seen anyone's thoughts? Have you ever felt anyone else's feelings? Have you ever looked through anyone else's eyes? No. Your experience of subjective consciousness has been through and entirely through your own physical formation of energy and particles. Okay. Everyone else, you can just look at them from the outside and you can see their physical form objectively, but you can't see what they are subjectively experiencing within it, within their own physical form, their bodies. And that's the same for any conscious entity. So it's the same for a dog or any animal you look at, or an electron. You can't see their subjective experience. Okay, empirical justification. So how is this law justified? empirically, according to experiments. Okay, the body and brain have been physically investigated, dissected, and observed on all physical scales. And no subjective conscious experience has ever been observed. All that is observed is the objective manifestation of physical energy in various forms, such as grey matter, neurons, microtubules, electrons, protons, and neutrons, etc. Consequences. This law has a number of important consequences, and failure to explicitly confront these consequences has been the primary impediment to the construction of a valid theory of consciousness. Okay, so now I state 4 consequences of the law of privacy. 1. All scientists and all humans have only ever and can only ever directly observe their own consciousness. Your belief in the existence of any consciousness apart from your own is based on objective observations of behaviors that have convinced you subjectively that the entity in question is conscious. For example, you cannot objectively prove that your mom or wife, say, is conscious. If you believe she is conscious, this belief is based on your objective observations of her behavior that convince you she is conscious in a way similar to yourself. In fact, you decide some entity is conscious in the same way that we decide if an artificial intelligence possesses genuine intelligence in the Turing test. That is, by interacting with them in various ways until we are convinced of genuine consciousness or genuine intelligence, respectively. Okay, the third consequence. This means that the second consequence. This means that every scientist's understanding and knowledge of consciousness is necessarily grounded in their own personal experience of the consciousness they experience within their own physical form. Consequence 3, and this necessarily means that any definition of consciousness that does not include a subjective component that makes reference to each scientist's personal subjective experience of consciousness is invalid. This invalidates all modern scientific theories of consciousness, such as integrated information theory, since they attempt purely objective definitions and analyses of consciousness. Okay. So I think that law is clear enough. You're conscious, and that consciousness is you experience it within your own physical body, and it's being generated by your own physical body. And you can't see anyone else's consciousness, no matter how you inspect them. No matter if you cut off the top of their head and look at their brain, you'll just see grey matter. No matter how you scan their brain, no matter how closely you look at it, you'll only ever see neurons and microtubules and particles, electrons, protons, and neutrons, depending on how closely you look. But you won't ever see their thoughts or their feelings. So we call that the law of privacy. And yeah, that's already been implicitly acknowledged by the Turing test. So the Turing test is the scientific test for genuine artificial intelligence, created or stated or invented by Alan Turing, who gave the test as a human has a conversation with the AI in question, and if at the end of the conversation the human is convinced that they're talking to a genuine intelligence, well then that artificial intelligence has achieved genuine artificial intelligence. But you can see, because intelligence is a function of consciousness, we can't objectively be sure it's there because we can't objectively observe it. So our decision that artificial intelligence is actually there is necessarily a subjective judgment. Okay, so that law aligns with the Turing test. Okay, so that's the law of privacy. I think that's the most straightforward law. You're very used to it. You only experience your own consciousness. Now we move on to principle 2, and this is called the postulate of intrinsic consciousness. So this is the big change in postulate. Before my theory, scientists were operating under another postulate which doesn't work, which is that all the basic energy and matter of our universe is devoid of consciousness. That assumption is what creates the hard problem of consciousness. Because the hard problem of consciousness is, how are we conscious if all the energy and particles we're made of aren't conscious? Now you change the postulate to energy is intrinsically conscious and always has been since the Big Bang. And the hard problem immediately disappears, and you're able to very quickly and naturally put together principles for a physics of consciousness, principles for a physics of consciousness. Okay, so the postulate of intrinsic consciousness. Let's begin. We'll just have another drink of water. Okay. According to modern science, all that has physical existence in our universe is physical energy, in many different formations, existing in space-time as defined by Einstein in his general relativity. So yeah, everything's made out of energy. Matter is made out of energy and can be converted back into energy by E equals mc squared. And modern neuroscience has proved beyond all reasonable doubt that our conscious experience is grounded in and dependent on the configurations of physical energy we refer to as our bodies, and particularly our brains. Therefore, there exist two and only two logical scientific possibilities for the existence of consciousness. One, so this is the conventional postulate. The basic energy of our universe was created not possessing consciousness as an intrinsic property, and then consciousness somehow discontinuously switches on or emerges within or around certain configurations of individually non-conscious energy and particles. That's the postulate all scientists are working under. And it just doesn't work. Or, so we look at the other possibility. There are only two possibilities. Or, the basic energy of our universe came into existence in the Big Bang, possessing consciousness as an intrinsic property. So energy came into existence in the Big Bang. It had some intrinsic properties. Something that has no intrinsic properties doesn't exist. You have to have some intrinsic properties or you don't exist. So energy had some intrinsic properties, and we are just adding consciousness to the set of intrinsic properties of energy. And we say, how can we justify doing this? Well, because when we do make this postulate, we can actually and finally construct a true physics of consciousness. And that's how you should understand as well that this is how physics works. Physics works on postulates. You have to have some basic assumptions at the most fundamental level about nature based on your observations. That are, a postulate is another word for an assumption. And all physics is based on assumptions. And the assumption for emergent theories, there's an assumption in emergent theories. And the assumption of emergent theories is that basic energy is non-conscious, which is just as much of an assumption. You can't prove, in the same way that you can't prove anyone apart from yourself is conscious, you also can't prove that anyone is not conscious, and you also can't prove that an electron and energy aren't conscious. How do we decide which postulate is true? We decide which postulate is true by seeing which one can be used to construct a logical theory that aligns with our experience of reality. That's just how physics works. Okay, a lot of people don't know that that's how physics works, and they say, oh, you can't just say that, there's no evidence. Well, there's no evidence for any consciousness apart from your own. And you can actually do that in science because science works on postulates. And how the postulates are justified is if you can make a good, usable theory out of them. And with the second postulate, we can make a usable theory. So we select the second postulate as correct for the following reasons. 1. For 100 years, the scientific establishment has pursued only the first possibility, and it has proven a total theoretical dead end. There still exists no technically valid theory of emergent consciousness that sensibly solves the hard problem. If you spend so long trying and totally failing to describe the universe under one of two possible assumptions, it means you're working under the wrong assumption. And then I've written CF, the Copernican revolution. So yes, it's exactly analogous to the Copernican revolution, which you probably know about. Before Copernicus, every astronomer assumed that the Earth was at the center. It was just this one assumption that every single scientist of the time was working under. So then they tried to construct models and theories of the solar system. The first thing they would always do was put the Earth at the center. Now, if you put the Earth at the center, it is exceedingly difficult to make a theory of the solar system. Your theory becomes extremely convoluted and inelegant, and, well, you can look it up. It's called the Ptolemaic theory of the solar system. That's spelt with a P, PT, Ptolemaic. And take a look at it. It's very ungainly and inelegant, and not very philosophically satisfying at all. And then once you get Newton's laws and conservation of momentum and things like that, it doesn't align with Newton's laws at all. So that's how we know. And then Copernicus came along and changed the assumption, changed the fundamental postulate to, the sun is at the center. As soon as we put the sun at the center, everything becomes wonderfully clear. We just have ellipses. All the planets, the 9 planets, trace ellipses around the sun. So that's how we know the Copernican postulate is correct. Okay. In dramatic contrast, so reason number 2, we select the second postulate. In dramatic contrast, the second postulate immediately and simply and logically solves the hard problem of consciousness. We are intrinsically conscious physical entities because we are formed out of nothing but intrinsically conscious energy and particles. So this postulate is a scientific postulate. It's undeniably sorry about that. The people here or the men here like very loud motorcycles for some reason. They think it's impressive. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, it is a scientific postulate. If you can postulate that the particles, basic energy and particles aren't conscious, which again is just a postulate, you can't prove objectively that an electron isn't conscious, then it's just as logical and scientific to postulate that they are conscious, have basic consciousness. And this postulate does solve the hard problem of consciousness. We are intrinsically conscious, and check yourself. Throughout your entire body, you have consciousness throughout it, intrinsically, and that's because we are formed out of nothing but collections of chemically and electrically bound, intrinsically conscious energy and particles. Okay. Third reason, it allows for the construction of a simple, logical, and intuitive physics of consciousness that can be used to construct models of physico-conscious systems. So that's another thing. These principles can be used to construct models. Just like Newton's principles could be used to construct models of the dynamics of physical systems, we can use these principles to construct models of conscious systems. And you can check any other modern scientific theory of consciousness. None of them have been used at all to construct even the most basic models of consciousness. Whereas if you go into, I'll give another lecture on this YouTube channel, or you can check on Reddit. I have essays explaining the simplest models using these principles. They're very, very simple models, but that's how physics works. You start with simple models, and you move on to more complicated models. But it's very important that your principles can be used to construct models, and this is the only theory that can be used to construct models, which is another reason we know it's true. So, for example, Newton's first models of the solar system were extremely oversimplified. He modeled the Earth as a sphere with uniform density throughout, and now the Earth isn't like that at all. Well, it's just approximately like that. Actually, the Earth is not spherical, it's oblate, and it doesn't have uniform density throughout its mass. But those approximations that Newton made were close enough to reality that his model was still extremely accurate. And that's another thing to bear in mind. Physics is not an exact science. It's approximate mathematical models. And we keep developing these models till they become more and more accurate. So my initial models will be the simplest. Any new branch of physics always starts with the simplest models, and then more detail is added and they become more accurate as they're developed over time. And of course, as I said, I'm a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, so I'm no neuroscientist. So neuroscientists will be able to use these principles to construct much more accurate models because they know the central nervous system much more accurately than I do. Okay, the fourth reason. The second postulate can also be used as the basis of the simplest and most logical and intuitive interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. See the audio essay linked below for a statement and justification of this interpretation. Okay, so this is really important as well. This postulate, as I've shown in an essay on this channel, a long one called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, this postulate can be used to give a very simple and intuitive interpretation or explanation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, which for 100 years, the experiments of quantum mechanics have lacked a simple logical interpretation of all the experiments. It's famous for being confusing and not really making sense. Well, with the postulate that all energy and therefore all quantum particles are conscious, we get a very, very simple and intuitive interpretation of quantum mechanics, which really puts things beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. Because not only are we able to construct a good theory of consciousness and build models, but it also explains quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics and consciousness, two very famous scientific problems the two most famous scientific problems of the last century, and they're actually twin problems, twin mysteries. And if you solve one, you solve the other. So you get the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, you immediately get the solution to the hard problem, because the solution to both is that basic energy and particles are intrinsically conscious. Okay, and you'll see how that works later. And finally, the second postulate logically explains why we experience consciousness throughout our entire physical forms, as well as why purely physical things like light and chemicals, etc., immediately and continuously affect our conscious state. There are a number of other logical and empirical reasons to prefer this second postulate, but I'm trying to be as succinct as possible, and as usual, I'm failing to be succinct. But anyway, bear with me, please. It is the solution of the hard problem of consciousness, so it's worth some time and effort. You're intrinsically conscious throughout your whole body, which makes a lot of sense if all the particles are intrinsically conscious and they bind together into more and more complicated forms, and different forms give rise to different conscious experience. So you have one conscious experience in your fingertips because of the way the atoms and molecules are arranged there, and what types of atoms and molecules are there. And then you have a different conscious experience based from your eyes, because again, the basic energy and particles are configured into the form of an eye, which gives rise to visual experience. Okay. That's very briefly. Okay, we'll move on to the next principle. So that's the basic change in fundamental postulate. So a theory of consciousness has to have a basic postulate about are energy and particles intrinsically conscious or not? Was the energy in the Big Bang, did it possess at t equals 0, at the first moment of the universe, did the energy possess any consciousness or not? All theories till now have said no, that energy was non-conscious. I'm changing that postulate to yes, it was intrinsically conscious, and it takes on different forms. You are one such form of that basic energy, undoubtedly, and you are conscious because it's always been conscious intrinsically. So, and again, to repeat, the justification of that postulate, that change in postulate, is that we are able to construct a logical, sensible theory of consciousness that we can use to construct models, and that makes sense of our conscious experience. And also, there will be testable hypotheses or experiments to corroborate my theory. I have a number of experiments. I just want to get all the theoretical physics stated clearly first, and then I'll state the experiments that can be done to prove this. Okay, so principle number 3 is called localism. Localism. Statement: consciousness is a local phenomenon. Okay, Now, this is important in physics. So we want a scientific, physical theory of consciousness. And localism is very important to all existing conventional physics. And that just means that near things nearby to one another affect each other more than things far away. Okay? So the sun has a much stronger gravitational field than the Earth, but you're much closer to the Earth. So your conscious experience of gravity is dominated by the Earth's gravitational field because you're closer to it. That's what localism is. Just that things nearby affect things nearby more than they affect distant things. So the light from the sun totally dominates your experience of light compared to the more distant stars. Okay? Now, consciousness, I'm saying all energy is conscious. Therefore, all physical processes are conscious processes. And therefore, things that are true about physical energy are also true about consciousness, because physical energy is physical consciousness. Okay, consciousness is a local phenomenon. So I say here, like all the physical phenomena and forces of our universe, except possibly for the yet to be understood phenomenon of quantum entanglement, consciousness is a local phenomenon. Physico-conscious entities and processes have more of an effect on the conscious states of nearby entities than on distant entities. Empirical justification. All of your experience of consciousness testifies to this principle. Nearby friends can alter your conscious state more than friends on a different continent. Okay? That's because physically they're nearer to you, so they can touch you and exert pressure on you, and you can see them. If they're very far away, you can't see them, or you need some means of seeing them. The light from the sun affects your conscious life more than that of the distant stars. And the Earth's gravitational field, despite being much weaker than the sun's, totally dominates your conscious experience of gravity because you are closer to the Earth. Yeah, I don't... Oh yeah, so another couple of points here. Yeah, also, your conscious experience is local. I mean, look around you. You can only see what's nearby you. Your conscious experience is totally local to wherever your physical form is. You can hear within a certain range that's centered around your head. You can see within a certain range. And the further away from you, the less conscious experience you can have of things. So your conscious experience is local. And also, this principle as well is important. This principle is important in the building of models, conscious models, physico-conscious models, theoretical models. And when I come to relativity, so that is the conscious derivations of special. At the moment I'm working on conscious derivations of special and general relativity. Taking me a little bit of time. But I'm busy, so anyway. They're coming slowly but surely. But we'll see, to get the conscious derivations of special and general relativity, localism is very important, because localism is very important to relativity theories. So if you know anything about relativity, you'll know that for Einstein, when he came up with his theories of relativity, what he did was he imagined a person, an observer, he said, at every point in space. So to work out these theories, you have to imagine conceptually. You imagine an observer, and obviously that's a conscious observer, at every point in space, armed with a clock and a measuring rod. Which basically means that conceptually, to derive relativity, you have to imagine consciousness at every point in space. Which aligns perfectly with my theory, where the whole of the universe is filled with energy, and all that energy is conscious. And time is, what relativity says is that time is local. That, time can be different in different parts of the universe, and space can be differently shaped in different parts of the universe. And it depends what's local to that point in space is what determines how time and space are experienced there. So space has a particular shape here on Earth because of the Earth being here, because we're close to the Earth. That shapes our experience of space here. Okay, so that lines up with localism. Time and space are defined locally. And that makes sense with my theory, because consciousness is local, and time and space are conscious experiences. Okay. So, do please leave, if you have any doubts, any things you'd like to clear up, or that you'd like me to make more clear, leave those doubts in the comments. The next lecture I'm going to do after this is actually, someone has read this statement of the principles and had some doubts, and my next lecture will actually be me reading those doubts and explaining them. So if you have any doubts at the moment so far, do check out that lecture. The next one, that'll be lecture 6, because I could well have answered the doubt in that lecture. Because I'm trying to be brief here and just state all the principles in one lecture, but obviously each principle I could dedicate an hour or two talking about and justifying each principle, which I can certainly do if people want. Okay, but let's move on. So that's localism. So do bear in mind to check these principles out with your own experience of consciousness. That's what's interesting about my theory compared to all the other theories. All the other theories, you've got talk about extra dimensions and multiverses and all this, basically what I think is modern nonsense, and I don't think it's real science. And none of them kind of really correlate with your own experience of being a physical and conscious entity. I mean, you even have a plethora of modern theories that say consciousness doesn't exist, or that you're a zombie and all your conscious experience is an illusion. Well, if you're trying to explain, our only experience of reality is through our consciousness. So if we're trying to explain reality and then we say, reality is an illusion, well, I mean, that doesn't really, well, to me it doesn't make sense. We're trying to experience our conscious experience of reality as we experience it. And my theory actually lines up with your day-to-day conscious experience of being a physical and intrinsically conscious being. Okay. Let's move on to the next principle. So the next principle, and again, this principle aligns with or corresponds exactly, works in the exact analogy with conventional, objective Newtonian physics. And that's really one of the strongest arguments in favor of my theory. Because Newton's theory works, and we're working but in the same way, in analogy with him. And like before Newton, there's plenty of talk on gravity. Aristotle wrote quite a bit about gravity, and it was interesting. He wasn't a million miles from the truth. But what was the difference between Aristotle's work on gravity and Newton's work on gravity is the fact that Newton came up with simple, well-defined principles and laws that can be used to make models. Now, Newton also had to come up with calculus. There wasn't much Aristotle was going to be able to do without calculus. So Newton was lucky enough to be such a genius that he could also come up with calculus at the same time, which is obviously essential. Okay. Now, thankfully, I don't have to come up with any new maths. And you might ask, why? If you've got a new physical theory, why don't you have to come up with any maths? Well, because the mathematics, what does conventional objective physics do? Conventional objective physics constructs approximate. Remember, all physics is approximate. It's not exact. Approximate mathematical maps of the energy of our universe and the different forms it can take on and the different processes it can undergo. So the mathematical maps describing the forms, the physical forms and configurations and processes have all been quite extensively developed. What the physics of consciousness is to systematically and scientifically deduce the conscious experiences within the physical forms, because we can't objectively see the conscious experience. By the law of privacy, we can't objectively see consciousness. So we have to deduce it systematically, and that's what these principles do. So I don't need to come up with any new maths, because the maths has already been written. We're just expanding, and again, this is another reason we can know my theory is correct, because it works by expansion. we're not changing any conventional physics. There's no new physics or new substances or new dimensions or anything like that. We're taking conventional physics and expanding it by adding consciousness. And so all physics works by expansion, where the previous physics is an approximation to the new physics. So all conventional physics is an approximation to my physics, where the approximation being made is setting consciousness to zero. So that's how all conventional physics works. You assume there's an assumption of no consciousness and just things just working by way of universal laws. So consciousness has been set to zero, but we know consciousness isn't zero because we're conscious. So now the physics of consciousness is adding, I'd like to think of it as coloring in the mathematical map, with subjective experience. And we do that systematically and scientifically with these principles. Okay, so the fourth principle is called the principle of similar forms. So statement. Conscious experience depends on the physical configuration of the conscious energy and particles within which it is experienced. Okay? So your conscious experience depends on the physical configuration of the conscious energy and particles that make you up. And then also it's influenced by those energy and particles are also in connection with your surrounding universe as well, and those connections also affect and change your conscious experience. Okay, similar configurations of conscious energy and particles experience similar subjective conscious states within themselves. Different configurations experience different conscious states within themselves. Okay, so humans were all similar configurations of conscious energy and particles. Take two normal or, healthy humans, 2 eyes, 1 nose, a brain, and our brains are all configured the same way unless there's some damage or some genetic deformation or something like that. We'll have the same brain regions and stuff. Our brains will share the same map and configuration of neurons, and that's why we all have similar conscious experiences, because we're similar configurations. And then you take something like a jellyfish, it's a very different configuration, so it has different conscious experience. Okay. Which is why humans can communicate with one another, and we struggle to communicate with jellyfish. Empirical justification. So this principle is exactly analogous to our most basic understanding of conventional objective physics. That is Newtonian physics and modern physics. In objective physics, different physical objects are formed out of different physical configurations of the same basic energy and particles, and possess different physical properties depending on their respective configurations. Okay. Likewise, in conscious physics, different physical configurations experience different configuration-dependent conscious states subjectively within themselves. So again, my theory works by analogy with conventional physics, Newtonian physics. So a great way of thinking of energy is to think of it like the basic clay of our universe, because it can take on many different forms. So energy is like the basic clay. You can take energy and you can form a ball, a billiard ball, or a tree, or a human, or a planet, or a moon, but it's all made out of the same basic energy and the same protons, neutrons, and electrons. So, and all those different things will have different physical properties based on their configuration. Now what we're saying is all those things will experience within themselves conscious experience that is dependent on the configuration as well. And different configurations, like they give rise to different objective physical properties, give rise to different subjective conscious experiences within themselves. So let's take an example of carbon atoms. And it's not just the shape, for example. Like there's a mannequin, you can have a mannequin made out of plastic, and it'll be shaped exactly like a human, but its conscious experience within itself will be nothing like a human's conscious experience. Why? Well, it's made out of different material. It's made out of, the electrons, protons, and neutrons are configured into plastic and it's hollow, and so it's not just the actual shape. It's to do what atoms are used, what molecules are used and how they're configured. So to make a human, they need to be configured exactly like a human is configured, with all the different materials. So yeah, one good example is carbon atoms. So you can take some number of carbon atoms, and if you configure them in one pattern, so to make something like a rock or a crystal, you configure atoms in a pattern, and these patterns are called crystal lattices. And rocks and crystals and things like that are very, very, very simple constructions. They're just repeating patterns of atoms or molecules. And they're called crystal lattices. Humans are much more complex. We don't have just repeating patterns of atoms. We have great complexity in our brains. There's great complexity, and not just great complexity, but there's also plasticity, as in the configuration can change. That's why you can change your imagination all the time, because you can change the configuration of the neurons in your brain. And each different configuration gives rise to a different conscious experience, and that's how your imagination works. But in a crystal lattice, all the atoms stay in the same place. So then we can know that the conscious experience of a rock or a crystal is continuous, a constant. There's no plasticity, so they can't have us in our very complex brains, we have plasticity, so we can change the configuration, and therefore you can imagine whatever. You can imagine a tree, or you can imagine a football. Each of those two imaginings will be based in different configurations of neurons in your brains. Okay. Oh yeah, so I'm talking about carbon atoms. So you arrange the carbon atoms in one way, and you will get graphite. And graphite is the material that's used in pencils for writing. And it has certain physical properties. For one, it's very soft. In fact, graphite is a material that is stacked in layers. So as these crystal lattices, these patterns of carbon atoms, and these patterns of carbon atoms are stacked, so there'll be a layer of carbon atoms in a pattern, and then there'll be another layer above it, and so on. And so in a pencil lead, it's all these stacked layers of sheets of laminas, actually is the word, laminas of carbon atoms. And when you write with your pencil, the topmost lamina of carbon atoms is left on the page. And this is why, as you write, the pencil wears down and the lead gets shorter and shorter, because you're leaving layers of carbon atoms on the paper. But you can take the exact same carbon atoms and you can rearrange them into a different configuration. Now you'll need very high pressure to do this, but it can be done in the lab. Rearrange the same carbon atoms and you will get a diamond. Now, you've used the same carbon atoms, you've just rearranged their configuration, and now you get very different physical properties. Now you've got a diamond, much, much, much harder, can't be used to write, isn't in this laminar form, you can't leave layers of it on a page, you'll never leave any layers of it on a page, no matter how hard you press it on a page. Same carbon atoms, same basic stuff, same basic clay, in a different formation, different properties. And all we're saying is that all these atoms and molecules are conscious, because all energy is conscious. So within each different formation, you get different subjective conscious experience. Okay? So I think that's fairly clear. And your conscious experience is dependent on your physical form and things that you're made of. Okay. So yeah, energy is like the basic clay of our universe. You can take clay and you can make a cup, and you can take clay and you can make a plate. And then the cup and the plate will have different physical properties, and you could say, and you could put them both on a table, and you could say, what's on this table? And you could say a cup and a plate. But an equally valid answer, and maybe a more deeply true answer, is you could say there's a quantity of clay, because it's all clay. And that's what our universe is. Our universe is conscious energy formed into many different formations, and it's all connected, by the way. But there are different densities of connection. So your fingers are densely connected to your hand, but you're also in physical connection with the air molecules around you. It's just a very weak connection that you can move through, and you can dramatically change the connection by moving your hand. But the whole universe is made of this conscious clay, and you're made of this conscious clay, and it started off in a very simple state, which was the Big Bang state, where it was all just crammed into one point, and there was no differentiation. It was totally homogeneous, and then it's expanded. And not only is it expanded, it's also differentiated into particles and electric charge and all these different things. And over 14 billion years, it's evolved into many, many different physical forms. And these forms over the 14 billion years have got more and more complex. And it's gone from the basic energy to elementary particles to atoms to molecules to cells, to amoebas, and all the way up through billions of years of conscious evolution, all the way up to humans. And here's the thing about humans: we've achieved a level of complexity in our configuration. Complexity in configuration gives rise to complexity in conscious experience. And we're so complex that we're able to actually notice that we exist. A dog doesn't notice that it exists. It does exist, and it's conscious, and it consciously exists, but it lives in a constant present. And it doesn't have the linguistic or intellectual abilities to go, oh, whoa, because this is self-reflection. I exist, wow, and look at its hand and go, whoa, I actually exist in this universe, and I'm conscious in this universe. That takes a great level of complexity that only very recently have humans achieved. So now we are able to look around our universe and say, and start questioning how we exist, and what is the nature of the universe, and what is the nature of our consciousness, which is what physics is, and it was what the physics of consciousness is. Okay, and then what happened was we looked at particles, and their behavior is so basic, they're so much less complex than us, that their behavior at first sight, at first glance, appeared to be non-conscious. But now we've looked more closely, and the experiments of quantum mechanics prove that it is actually the result of intrinsic consciousness. Okay, let's move on. All of our everyday experience of consciousness, as well as all of empirical neurology, testifies to this principle. Humans have similar conscious experiences to one another because we are similar configurations of conscious energy and particles. For example, we possess similarly configured eyes and occipital lobes. That's one of the visual centers in your brain, within which we experience similar visual conscious experience. And similar defects in the eye give rise to similar changes in visual conscious experience, such as color blindness. So color blindness is a regular, well-defined change in the rods and cones of your eyes. There are different types of color blindness, but they're all well-defined, they've all been well-studied. And they are physical changes in the rods and cones of your eyes. And these give rise to differences in your conscious experience. Why? Because conscious experience is dependent on the configuration of the energy and particles involved in the parts of your body experiencing the consciousness. Okay. Different regions of the brain are reliably associated with different conscious experiences. These regions are similarly constructed within different brains, and similar alterations to these physical constructions reliably correlate with similar predictable changes in the conscious experience of the patient. For example, specific drugs consistently give rise to specific temporary changes in the chemical configuration of the brain, corresponding to consistent changes in the conscious experience of the patient. Okay, in short, humans can understand and communicate with one another because we are such similar configurations of the same basic conscious energy. And we therefore experience similar conscious states within ourselves. Differences in our conscious experiences correspond with differences in our physical configuration. My memories are specific neuronal structures in the memory centers of my brain, and your different memories are different neuronal structures within your brain. If these structures are damaged, by Alzheimer's for example, the specific memories are lost. Dogs share a lot of similar physico-conscious structures with humans, such as eyes and a stomach. As such, we can understand a lot of their conscious behavior and form sympathetic relationships with them, though our differences are significant enough that their conscious lives remain somewhat mysterious to us. A jellyfish is a much more different physico-conscious configuration than a dog to a human, and its conscious experience within itself is proportionally mysterious. This is why we tend not to get so attached to pet jellyfish. Okay, A corollary to this principle is that more complex configurations experience more complex conscious experiences within themselves. Thus, our superior intelligence and more complex conscious experience within the animal kingdom is due to the increased complexity of our brains. Okay, we can recap that a little bit, I suppose. So a good example of this, and it's a good example of how we make models, is taste and drugs. So let's look at taste using my principles, and you'll see how my principles are actually capable of constructing theoretical models. So how does taste work? Well, you have receptors in your tongue. Receptors in your tongue are little holes that molecules can fall into. And these holes surround the molecule falls in the hole, and the molecule being in the hole creates a chemical interaction between the taste receptor and the molecule. Okay? And different molecules have different physical shapes, different physical configurations, so they give rise to different physical interactions within the taste receptor, the little hole in your tongue. So sugar, for example, tastes like sugar because it has its own molecular configuration. Sugar has a well-defined molecular configuration, and then salt has another different molecular configuration. So the sugar goes into the hole and it's shaped one way, and that shape interacts with your taste receptor to give rise to the experience of sugar, and salt has a different molecular configuration that gives rise to the taste of salt. Now, according to my theory, the salt molecules and the sugar molecules are both conscious. Now, they're only molecules, so their consciousness is their physical configuration is extremely simple. They're very simple configurations. So they have very simple conscious experience. But they are conscious, and so is the taste receptor in your tongue. So the sugar molecule goes into the taste receptor in your tongue and has a physical interaction there, particularly a chemical interaction with the taste receptor. And according to my theory, all physical processes, since all energy is conscious, all physical processes are also conscious processes. So the sugar molecule causes a particular physical process, and therefore a particular conscious process within and around the taste receptor of your tongue. Then, this particular conscious process, physico-conscious process, your tongue is full of nerves, and these nerves lead to your brain via nerve fibers. The nerves are embedded in your tongue. So, and remember, consciousness is local. So the nerve fiber nearby the taste receptor shares in the conscious experience of the taste receptor, shares in that taste experience that the tongue receptor is having. And then that conscious experience is transmitted in a kind of chain of conscious experience. Each nerve molecule in the nerve fiber has a conscious experience that changes the nerve molecule next to itself, and it is like a chain all the way up to your brain, where in the taste center of your brain you experience the taste. Or basically your central nervous system is a physico-conscious apparatus that's taken billions of years to evolve, that creates a center of consciousness. And within your center of consciousness, within your central nervous system, you share in the conscious experience of your tongue. Okay, and then your nervous system is a bunch of nerve fibers distributed throughout your body. And they're embedded in all the different parts of your body, and they share in the conscious experience of different parts of your body. And then the conscious experience is shared with each molecule in the nerve fiber all the way up to your center of consciousness where you experience it. So there you see, very briefly, we get a model of how taste works based on consciousness. If energy isn't conscious, well then, there is no model then. Then your tongue is not conscious, the sugar molecules aren't conscious, and there's some physical process there that is transmitted by the nerve fibers up to your brain, and then somehow, somewhere within the brain, in a way that no one has ever explained or even come close to explaining, consciousness somehow turns on. And they'll never come up with a model because it just doesn't work. It's the wrong postulate. And for 100 years they've been trying to come up with a theory to make sense of this, how the consciousness switches on, and it just doesn't work. Whereas you can see, I mean, maybe I didn't explain it too well there, but you can see how we get it, how we start building models of conscious systems. But it just makes sense if everything is conscious. It makes sense of light as well. Light is conscious energy. It interacts with the conscious rods and cones of your retina, changing their conscious experience. They're connected to the conscious molecules in your optic nerve fiber. So the change in the rods and cones conscious experience changes the nerve fibers conscious experience, which changes the nearest neighbors in the nerve fibers molecules connected in a line. So if one changes, it changes the one next to it and changes the one next to it. So this change in consciousness works all the way up the optic nerve fiber to the visual centers of the brain, where they change the configuration of the visual centers of the brain, and that change in configuration of the visual centers of your brain is experienced by you, because you are your brain, as the visual perception. Okay, so this explains how sweeteners work, for example. Now, a sweetener is a molecule that's not exactly like sugar. It's not exactly the same configuration as sugar. If it was exactly the same configuration, then it would be sugar, but it's a similar configuration. And because it's a similar configuration, it creates a similar physical process within the taste receptors of your tongue. So you experience, and that physical process is a conscious process as well. And because it's a similar physical process, it's also a similar conscious process, or a similar conscious sensation. So you experience the sweetener, because it has a similar configuration as sugar, you experience a similar taste as sugar, which is why you can put sweetener in your tea instead of sugar. You can still taste the difference. If you're sensitive to these things, you can still taste the difference between sweetener and sugar, because there will be slightly different conscious experiences. All of the same applies for drugs. You ingest some chemical, it goes up to your brain, it changes the chemical configuration of your brain, which changes your conscious experience. Similar chemicals will change the brain in similar ways. That's why you have weed, and then you have spice, which is an artificial weed, and it gives similar effects because molecularly it's a similar configuration. Although spice is very dangerous, and the differences in its configuration can have pretty disastrous effects. It's not as safe as weed, as we all know. Okay, I think that's enough for that. So yeah, your conscious experience depends on how the conscious particles and energy of your body are configured. Okay, so we move on finally. This is the last one. Been talking for an hour. So principle 5 is the quantum theory of limited free will. Now this, of all the principles, this is the one that probably most deserves a full hour or two being spoken about and developed. So, that's what I'll do. I do plan a lecture soon just on free will, explaining how and this is a great thing about my theory as well. It means that you have free will, just as you feel like you have free will. You don't have total free will. You can't fly or anything, Your free will is constrained by the physics of your physical form as well as your surrounding universe. But the choices that you feel like you make freely, like you might choose to like this video or dislike this video, or to subscribe. That'll be a free choice based on you. Or as you feel free when you make such a choice. Like if someone said, "Why did you click like?" You say, "Well, because I wanted to." And what my theory shows is, that's an intrinsic property of the energy of our universe, is to be able to choose between limited sets of possible future states. Okay, And just to say, there is another audio lecture on this channel called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, and that's an hour and a half long, and that justifies this quantum theory of free will. It gives the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, finally. So after more than 100 years, we have a satisfactory explanation of the experiments of quantum mechanics that you can listen to on that lecture. And yeah, I'd highly recommend it because, yeah, finally, quantum mechanics makes sense, and it also makes sense in a way that aligns with our everyday experience of being conscious, which is great because we're made of nothing but quantum particles. So if we can understand how they're conscious and how they work, and it also makes sense of how we're conscious and how we work, well, that's how you know a theory is correct, because it makes sense of a broad range of phenomena. Okay. So, Principle 5, the quantum theory of limited free will. Statement. Quantum entities such as photons and electrons are intrinsically conscious entities that can consciously perceive their local surrounding universe, as well as consciously and freely select from limited sets of possible future states to instantiate. So, yeah. You can freely choose to do whatever you want to do as long as it's physically possible. So you can imagine flying, but you never will be able to actually fly, at least as you know now at this point in our evolution, because it's not physically possible. Humans have a very powerful imagination, so we can imagine doing that. But you know that you won't ever be able to actually take off, because you know what it's like to possess a human physical form. A bird, on the other hand, has a different physical form that creates different possibilities, a different set of future possibilities for itself. So it can imagine flying, and it can also actually, because of its physical form, it's actually capable of doing such, and it can choose to take off and fly when it wants to. Okay, so good news, great news, you have free will, but it is limited by your physical form, and it's limited by your physical form as well as the universe around you, such as gravitational fields and things like that. You know, you at the moment you can choose to get up out of your chair, but if you're on a planet with a much stronger gravitational field, you wouldn't be able to choose to get up out of your chair because the gravitational field would be too strong. And also your free will can be overpowered. For example, I could send men to your house and they could tie you to your chair, and then they will have constrained the physical possibilities available to you. They will have reduced your set of possible future states. You won't be able to freely choose to get out of your chair. So you have free will, but it can be constrained. Okay, so let's read this here. The experiments of quantum mechanics investigate the behavior of individual quantum entities such as photons, electrons, atoms, and molecules. These experiments have demonstrated, among other things, that quantum experiments involve the selection of a final state from limited sets of possible future states, where the set of possible future states is defined by the physical properties of the quantum entity in question, as well as the physical properties and constraints imposed on the entity by the experimental apparatus surrounding it. Okay, so for you, the experimental apparatus surrounding you is your local universe. But then we can get an electron or a photon and we put it in an experimental apparatus, and that apparatus puts constraints on the particle and we examine its behavior within those constraints. Okay, the selection of future states by quantum systems is not deterministic. So that was the big takeaway fact from quantum mechanics. Newtonian mechanics described the world using deterministic maths. Quantum mechanics comes along and no longer can we use deterministic maths. Why? Because we're starting to look at individual particles making individual conscious choices. Okay. I'm going to give another lecture about the difference between determinism and free will. Okay, so the selection of future states by quantum systems is not deterministic. No matter how thoroughly we investigate a given system, it is impossible to determine which possible future state the system will select before the selection is made. Okay, let me just get that clear. So it is impossible. no matter how closely we look at the system to determine which possible future state a system will select before the selection is made. So it's not deterministic. The best we can do is to identify each of the possible future states available to the system and assign a probability to each state that it will be the one selected. Okay? This probability represents the percentage of times that the state will be selected if the experiment is carried out a large number of times. Okay, so we have some system, we look at it and we say, okay, its final state is always either A, B, or C. 3 possibilities. Now, it could be more than that. It could be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever. Or it could just be A and B. So what we can do is identify, a system like this always ends up in state A, B, or C. But we can't say beforehand, when we do the experiment, which state it will wind up in. All we can say is, for example, there's a 25% chance we'll end up in A, a 25% chance we'll end up in B, and a 50% chance it will end up in C. That's the best we can do, is assign probabilities. Okay, the selection of a future state is technically known as the collapse of the wave function. Okay, that's just when the selection of the future state is made. It's just called the collapse of the wave function for historical reasons. And mathematical reasons. Conventionally, the collapse of the wave function has been interpreted as resulting from the intrinsically probabilistic nature of the most basic energy and particles of our universe. So people thought that the particles were just behaving like this because that's their intrinsic nature. This interpretation is philosophically very unsatisfying as well as incoherent with our subjective experience of reality. Because we're made of these particles and we don't experience reality like that. Indeed, it creates a variant of the hard problem of consciousness. Why do we experience ourselves as intrinsically conscious, as well as capable of making free conscious selections from limited sets of possible future states, if we are formed out of non-conscious and intrinsically probabilistic energy and particles? Okay, and that question just can't be solved. So we change the postulate. The postulate of intrinsic consciousness allows for a far more simple, logical, and intuitive interpretation that logically solves the hard problem of consciousness and also perfectly aligns with our everyday subjective experience as physico-conscious beings. Briefly, all quantum entities are intrinsically conscious entities possessing 2 fundamental conscious properties: some physico-conscious connection to and perception of their local surrounding universe. So you can agree with that. You're connected by light and gravity to your local surrounding universe, and you also have conscious perception of your local surrounding universe. Not the whole universe, just the universe around you. And 2, the conscious ability to select from limited sets of possible future states and actions. Okay, so you also can do that as well. You can choose to stand up or sit down, click like or click dislike, to subscribe or not to subscribe, which is my fancy way of saying like, share, and subscribe. Okay. All the experiments of quantum mechanics can be simply, logically, and consistently interpreted with these simple principles. And then I say, listen to the following audio essay for a detailed explanation of the conscious interpretation of quantum mechanics. So yeah, that's that other essay I told you about, which is called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness. And in that essay, I explain 4 very famous quantum mechanical experiments and show that this interpretation is consistent with all the experiments of quantum mechanics, and it also aligns with our own conscious experience of being conscious entities, because we have conscious perception around us, and we do choose from possibilities that depend on the universe surrounding us, as well as depend on our own physical form and the physical form of our brains and things. Because, for example, education changes the physical configuration of your brain, which opens up new possibilities for you. So, for example, if I have to go to work, I can either walk or take the bike. Now, I never learned how to drive, so there could be a car there, but I can't choose to take the car. I mean, I could choose to take the car, but I wouldn't, because that'd be disastrous. Whereas if I got driving lessons, that would change the configuration of my brain in such a way that I would know how to drive, and then that would open up a new possibility for me, which I could choose to instantiate. So you see how These possibilities depend on our physical configuration. And then you could, for example, we could look at your brain and we could isolate the regions that are linked with you being able to drive, and we could destroy those regions, and then you wouldn't be able to drive to work anymore. Wouldn't want to do that to you, of course, but it's just physically possible. Okay, so check out that other essay if you'd like to understand quantum mechanics more in terms of consciousness. The basic energy and particles of our universe are individual conscious entities that possess conscious perception of their local universe, as well as the conscious ability to select from limited sets of possible future states and actions. These energy and particles can physico-consciously bond into larger, more complex individual conscious entities, such as yourself, that possess conscious perception of their local universe, look around yourself, as well as the ability to select from limited sets of possible future states and actions to instantiate based on these conscious perceptions. Like, share, and subscribe. Conclusion. Finally, these simple principles form the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Okay, so you can see how simple they are, and you can see how explanatory they are, and how they can be used to build models and such. And these principles align perfectly with our subjective experience of consciousness, the only evidence of consciousness that exists, and they can be used to construct simple physico-conscious models of conscious systems. See my other posts for some examples of such models. As the first of such models, and given that I'm a physicist and not a neuroscientist, they are inevitably somewhat oversimplified, but they serve as proof of the explanatory power of my theory. Remember, it took over 300 years after Newton published his principles before we could say that Newtonian mechanics was complete. Okay, here's the technical scientific definition of consciousness, grounded in both our objective and subjective experiences of reality. So in the description, I'll leave the technical scientific definition of consciousness, which is well worth a look. And I'm going to read that and explain that in the next lecture. Shortly, I'll publish an essay outlining several simple testable hypotheses to corroborate my theory. Finally, since people keep referring me to integrated information theory, my next post will be a technical explanation of why this theory is not a valid scientific theory of consciousness. Okay, very quickly I can explain that now. Integrated information theory says that consciousness is integrated information. Well, first of all, that doesn't really mean very much, because to integrate information, you need consciousness in the first place. Integrating information is an act of consciousness. So it's a circular definition for a start. Also, it doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness. Why? Because you need a system involving both information as well as the physical means to integrate the information. And in the Big Bang, the energy was totally homogenized and undifferentiated, so there were no systems in the Big Bang at all. There was just one point of extremely dense energy, so there was no information and there was no physical mechanism for integrating the information. So therefore consciousness didn't exist at t=0 in the Big Bang. So you still have to explain because all information is made out of energy, whether it be written words on a page or musical notes. Musical notes are all vibrations of molecules, and all the air molecules, and all the molecules are made out of energy. So the integration of information is still energetic processes. It's a process of physical energy in the form of information being integrated by some other formation of physical energy that integrates information. So you have to explain how this physical process gives rise to consciousness, or else you haven't solved the hard problem. Integrated information is actually a good definition of intelligence. It's what intelligence does, but intelligence requires consciousness a priori in the first place. And also, there are other problems with that theory, like what about, someone listens to music and then they integrate the information of the music into a melody. But then you have some people they develop certain aphasias and then they're unable to do that anymore. Then they just don't hear any melody. They don't integrate the information into music anymore. They just hear the notes chaotically without understanding that or integrating it into music at all. Does that mean they're any less conscious? No, of course not. They're still totally just as conscious as you are. They just aren't capable anymore of integrating it into information, but they still consciously hear the notes. The same with reading, for example. If I look at a text full of Chinese writing, that's obviously information, and I'm looking at it, taking it in, and I'm fully conscious of it, but I'm not integrating any of it because I don't know how to read Chinese. Whereas a Chinese person could look at the same text and they would see the text and integrate the information into understanding, into meaning. So they would actually integrate the information, whereas I wouldn't, and that wouldn't make them any more conscious than me. And you can actually have a conscious experience of chaoticness, or chaos, which is no integration of information. And yeah, basically it's just wrong. The basic energy of our universe is conscious. Okay. But anyway, I can explain that further, and if people keep on referring me to that theory, and I'm not sure why. Its definition of consciousness also is purely objective, and that's another problem, because consciousness isn't a purely objective phenomenon. So you need to have a subjective component to your definition, or else you haven't correctly defined consciousness. So if you check out my scientific definition of consciousness, you'll see that it has an objective component and a subjective component. And any definition of consciousness that doesn't include a subjective component isn't a valid definition of consciousness, unless you want to say that consciousness is a purely objective phenomenon, which is ridiculous, because theorizing about consciousness is a subjective conscious act. Okay, that's definitely enough now. So I hope you understood that. So that's a formal statement of the principles, and I explain them a lot. In the next lecture, I will address some doubts that someone sent to me based on reading. They just read the document and they had some doubts, so I'll explain those in a future lecture. The text itself hopefully is on the screen, but it will also be in the description below, along with a link to the essay on quantum mechanics and consciousness, as well as a link to the scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, so yeah, that's the solution to the hard problem of consciousness, finally, after however many hundreds of years. So that's pretty exciting. You might have to listen to it a few times. This is new physics, so it depends on how much physics you studied before. You might have to acquaint yourself with the principles of the scientific method and how scientific theories are constructed from first principles. You might need to listen to it a few times and leave any questions in the comments. Happy to answer them. But yeah, it'll take some time for you to dwell on it and reflect on it. And yeah, it opens up a lot of questions, because this is new physics, and new physics has to be developed. But this is the great thing. These principles we're able to begin an expandable, systematic treatment of consciousness. And this is the first theory that allows that, which is really how you can tell it's correct. It's also the simplest theory, because what exists in our universe? Just energy in space-time in different forms, in the 3 dimensions of space-time. What does my theory say exists? Just energy. It just says that it's all intrinsically conscious, just like your body is intrinsically conscious. And you don't need to talk about any extra dimensions or extra universes or anything like that, which is really good. That's how you know it's real science. Okay. So thanks for listening. Hope you understood. Hope you enjoy hearing the long-awaited solution to the hard problem. So yeah, check out the other lectures. Check out my upcoming lectures. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. All the best.